She had a mission statement. She said it clearly, repeatedly, publicly, for years. The WorldHeart Foundation existed to rescue the animals nobody else wanted. The ones that had been discarded, abandoned, forgotten. The ones the system had already given up on. And Linda Blair had built something out in the California desert that she described as their sanctuary, a place where suffering stopped, a place where she, the woman who once carried the weight of a generation's nightmares on her 14-year-old shoulders, had found her purpose. That was the story she told. Then, on a day in July 2025, more than 70 law enforcement agents arrived at her property with warrants. They weren't there for Linda Blair, the activist. They weren't there to honor the mission she had spent decades building in public. They were there because investigators believed something else was happening behind the gates of that desert ranch. Something that required 70 agents and multiple warrants to address. When the operation was over, 251 dogs had been removed from the property. 251. Not placed. Not transferred. Removed. The woman who declared herself a protector of the voiceless had just become the subject of one of the largest animal welfare operations in recent California history. And the questions it raised about intention, about belief, about the distance between a mission statement and a reality are questions the courts have not yet answered. And neither has she. If Linda Blair ever made you believe that some people spend their whole lives making up for the darkness they once carried, leave a like right now, because what investigators found at her ranch raises questions nobody was prepared to answer. Because what you are about to hear, very few people know. Linda Blair was 12 years old when she auditioned for The Exorcist. She was 13 when she got the part. And she was 14 years old. 14 when the film opened in December of 1973 and permanently changed what American audiences believed a child was capable of putting on screen. The Exorcist was not just a horror film. It was a cultural rupture. People fainted in theaters. Priests were called. Mental health professionals weighed in on whether the film should have been made at all. And at the center of all of it, the spinning head, the guttural voice, the imagery that burned itself into a generation's memory, was a girl from Westport, Connecticut, who had barely started high school. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences nominated her for Best Supporting Actress. She was 14 years old. That is not a footnote. That is the entire context for everything that followed. Because what most people don't talk about, what gets lost when we discuss Linda Blair as a cultural artifact, rather than as a human being, is what it actually costs to be that famous, that young, for that reason. She wasn't a child star in the conventional sense. She wasn't singing. She wasn't dancing. She was the face of possession, of violation, of something adults found so disturbing they left theaters early, and she had to go back to school on Monday. The years that followed were complicated in the way that years following extreme early fame are always complicated. There were more films. There were tabloid stories. There were struggles that played out in public because, when you become famous at 14 for The Exorcist, the public never fully lets you grow up on your own terms. Hollywood had a version of Linda Blair it preferred. The shock, the spectacle, the girl who had survived the impossible. And it wasn't particularly interested in the woman trying to figure out who she was underneath all of it. But something shifted. Quietly, then deliberately. At some point in her adult life, Linda Blair made a decision that would define the next several decades. She turned away from Hollywood, not entirely, not dramatically, but in the way that matters. And she turned toward animals. Specifically, toward the ones that other people had given up on. Strays. Abused dogs. Animals that had passed through shelters, through cruelty, through indifference, and arrived at the edge of what the system would do for them. She founded the WorldHeart Foundation, built infrastructure, acquired property in the California desert, created what she described publicly as a sanctuary for animals that had nowhere else to go. She talked about it with the conviction of someone who had genuinely found their reason. The girl who had been made to carry a generation's darkness on screen had reinvented herself, she said, as the person who absorbed the suffering of the voiceless and gave them somewhere safe to land. That was the identity she built. That was the mission she declared. And for years, the world took her at her word. There is a particular kind of public narrative that becomes nearly invisible because it is so emotionally satisfying. Linda Blair, as animal rights activist, was that kind of narrative. It made complete sense. The child who had been used, cinematically, commercially, culturally, as a vessel for something dark and disturbing, grows into an adult who dedicates her life to protecting the vulnerable. The arc wrote itself. It was the kind of story that journalists were happy to repeat, and audiences were happy to accept, because it gave The Exorcist a redemptive ending that the film itself never had. The WorldHeart Foundation gave the story institutional weight. This wasn't just a celebrity who posted about animals on social media. Blair had built something. She had a registered organization. She had a physical location, a property out in the California desert that she described as a working sanctuary for rescued dogs. She spoke at events. She gave interviews. She was, by every visible measure, a person who had converted personal pain into public good. And in the world of celebrity activism, that is usually where the story ends. The public decides to believe. The organization continues operating. Nobody looks too closely at what happens between the press releases. For years, that is exactly what happened with Linda Blair and the WorldHeart Foundation. What Linda Blair had built in the desert was, by her own description, a sanctuary. The word matters. A sanctuary is not just a place where animals are kept. It implies care. It implies capacity, the institutional ability to provide what the animals in your custody actually need. Food, medical attention, space, stimulation, the basic conditions under which a living creature can exist without suffering. A sanctuary is a promise. At some point before July 2025, that promise came under scrutiny. The precise timeline of how investigators became focused on Blair's property is still emerging. What is documented is that the concerns were serious enough and specific enough to justify a significant law enforcement response. This was not an anonymous tip that led to a routine welfare check. This was a coordinated operation involving multiple agencies and more than 70 agents executing warrants simultaneously. That level of response doesn't happen without predicate. It doesn't happen without investigators having already built a case sufficient to convince a judge to authorize the warrants. Something had been seen. Something had been reported. Something had crossed the threshold between concern and documented probable cause. The distance between Linda Blair runs an animal sanctuary and 70 agents with warrants is not a small distance. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of distance that requires explanation. On the day the operation executed, the scale of it was immediately notable. More than 70 law enforcement agents, multiple warrants, a coordinated response that suggested the authorities expected what they were going to find, or expected that what they were going to find would require significant resources to address safely and humanely. What they found was 251 dogs. Let that number sit for a moment. 251 individual animals on a single property, under the care of a single foundation led by one person. The sheer logistics of that number, feeding, veterinary care, sanitation, socialization, The daily labor of keeping that many living creatures in conditions that don't constitute suffering represent an operational challenge that would strain a well-funded, professionally staffed shelter with dedicated resources. The WorldHeart Foundation was not that. The dogs were removed, all 251 of them. In the language of animal welfare enforcement, removed and rescued are not always the same word, but they are sometimes the same action. And in this case, the authorities used both framings. The animals were taken into protective custody, transported, assessed. What their condition was when they were found, the specific details of what investigators documented inside that property, has not been fully released at the time this script was written. What has been confirmed is that the operation was large enough and the findings significant enough to justify removing every single animal from the premises. 251 dogs had been living on that property under the mission statement of the WorldHeart Foundation. 251 dogs were taken away from it. The legal consequences for Linda Blair remain, at this point, unresolved. No final charges have been confirmed at the time of this production. The investigation is ongoing. The courts have not reached a verdict. Blair has not made a detailed public statement addressing the specifics of what investigators found. What exists in the space between the mission she declared and the operation that answered it is a question, not a verdict. A question. The woman who said she existed to give suffering animals somewhere safe to land had built something in the desert that 70 agents decided required their immediate intervention. And the 251 dogs that were carried out of that property cannot tell us what they experienced inside it. But they are the evidence. They are the only evidence that ultimately matters. Not the press releases, not the interviews, not the Foundation's name, or its stated purpose, or the narrative arc that made such perfect emotional sense for so many years. 251 dogs. That is what was found at the sanctuary. Linda Blair spent more than 40 years building a second identity. Not the girl from The Exorcist, not the face that made audiences leave theaters early and call priests and debate whether a film like that should exist. That identity had been given to her, pressed onto a 14-year-old by an industry that understood spectacle better than it understood consequence. The second identity she chose herself, the protector, the advocate, the woman who looked at animals that the world had discarded and said, "Not on my watch." The WorldHeart Foundation wasn't a side project or a vanity cause. It was, by every account she ever gave, the thing that gave her life meaning after Hollywood finished with the version of her it had created. That matters. It matters because the worst possible reading of what happened in July 2025 is not the only reading available. There is a phenomenon that animal welfare researchers have documented and named. Hoarding disorder, in its animal-focused form, is not cruelty in the conventional sense. It is frequently found in people who began with genuine love, genuine intention, genuine belief that they were helping. The accumulation happens slowly. The capacity doesn't keep pace with the commitment, and the person at the center often cannot see the distance between what they believe they are providing and what the animals in their care are actually experiencing. Intention and outcome are not the same thing. That is the hardest question the WorldHeart Foundation raid leaves behind. Not whether Linda Blair is a villain, because that framing is too simple to be useful. The harder question is this: where is the line between a rescue mission and an accumulation that the animals themselves need to be rescued from? And who has the authority to draw that line? Especially when the person on the other side of it has spent decades believing, with apparent sincerity, that they were doing good. The courts will attempt an answer. They may reach one. But the 14-year-old who was handed a darkness she didn't choose grew into a woman who built a mission she believed in completely. And somewhere between that mission and 70 agents with warrants, 251 dogs were waiting for rescue. The question is only who they needed to be rescued from. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because the line between devotion and harm is harder to find than anyone wants to admit, and we want to know exactly where you stand. Like and subscribe, because the real stories behind the headlines are what we do here every single week.